Hello, everyone. Welcome to our live stream about the women's suffrage movement. I am Libba Beaucham, the Director of Media and Communications here at the Northeast Georgia History Center, and I'm coming to you live from our Terrell digital studio. I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which we celebrated yesterday on August 18th in 1920. And this granted women in the United States the right to vote. So I will be your host today as we meet two of our in-house historians, our Director of Education, Marie Walker, and our Archives Manager, Lesley Jones. Of course, with the time we have today, we can only scratch the surface of this fascinating, inspiring, and complex history of women's suffrage, but I hope that we can give you a great starting place to continue your own study. So we're going to begin in Britain with the British women's suffrage movement, which largely coincided with the American movement. And after conducting my interview with Marie, I felt that this would be a good starting place, as many of the traditional societal expectations of women that suffragists opposed have their roots in the Victorian and Edwardian era, and earlier, of course, too. But without further ado, I will let Marie herself tell us all about it. So let's dive into my interview with Director of Education and historian Marie Walker.
The American suffrage movement and the British suffrage movement really kind of went hand in hand. So, of course, you have the Americans starting out at Seneca Falls in the 1840s. Here in Britain, you don't really see organizations for women's suffrage starting until the 1860s. I believe the first one was founded in 1867, and that's when women are really organizing to get the vote. And then I don't want to say it's necessarily a race, because it wasn't. Everyone wanted to have the right to vote, but it was a little bit of a neck and neck to see who was American women going to get the right to vote first, was British women going to get the right to vote first. The British suffrage movement technically did succeed first, if you look at it, but not quite, because the British suffrage movement ended up being able to grant women the right to vote in 1918, but it was with a lot of stipulations. It was women over 30, it was women who had some type of property ownership, it was women who were either married to a man who owned property, or they had to have a certain stipulation of how much they were paying for rent, or if they graduated from a British university. But a lot of British universities at that time did not accept women. So some women had the right to vote. It enfranchised about 8 million women, but it wasn't an enfranchisement of all women. The Americans had a little bit more enfranchisement for women with the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920. And that granted women the right to vote regardless of their gender. Of course, did all women, women of color, people of color still had their voting rights infringed upon for a very long time after that. And it wasn't until 1928 when Britain really had full universal women's suffrage, where women who were, I think they said it was 21 at the time, but now the voting age has been lowered to 18. And actually, I just looked this up. It's 16 if you're voting in Scottish parliamentary elections or Welsh parliamentary elections, which I thought was so interesting, because I had never heard of, in America, you can't vote until you're 18 for anything. So they have different, depending on which elections you are voting in, as to how old you have to be. But at that time, I believe it was women who were 21 and older had the right to vote, regardless if they were property owners or married to property owners, or if they went to university or not, which really enfranchised the working class of women. So Emmeline Pankhurst actually came and toured America giving speeches during the First World War, because Britain got into the First World War much sooner than America did, and that kind of put on pause the British suffrage movement, was World War I, because a lot of the women went, and therefore they went to help with the war effort. And it really was these women showing their patriotic duty through the war effort that made the parliamentary members and people really see these women have been doing men's roles because all the men were needed to go fight on the front lines. They can really do things. They can do everything like a man can do. And that is what really I believe, and a lot of historical scholars believe, is what showed the British people that women were capable of handling the vote, that women were deserving of the vote, was their participation in World War I. Of course, it kind of put their movement on hold. They didn't have big rallies. They didn't have as much political press as they would have before World War I, that they were gaining a lot of press attention. And that was kind of their goal, was to make sure that they had the most headlines, that people were talking about them the most, because that's what affects action. So you have attention, and then you have action as a result of that. Of course, World War I, everyone's focused on the war and the war effort. So it's an interesting dynamic of, they weren't necessarily getting the most attention as they were for their movement, but their movement was still incredibly progressing as they were taking on this newfound freedom that they had because of the war, that they had to expand in women. It changed women's roles forever, not just in Britain, but also in America. Now we always think of school teachers as especially for elementary school teachers, as women. And that was not the conception before World War I. Almost all school teachers had been male before then. And then with World War I, women stepped into the role of teachers and have stayed there since World War I. Also the role of nurses. Women as nurses weren't really a thing until Florence Nightingale stepped out in the Crimea War, and then it was gaining an acceptance and popularity. But then in World War I, again, you have the nurses at the forefront of people's consciousness, and when sometimes people think of nurses in a gender stereotypical way, it's women, and that also originated in World War I. Of course, as we progress into modern era, we are always redefining gender norms and that, but it's interesting to see where those preconceptions come from, and a lot of that is World War I in this suffrage movement. But Emily Pankhurst actually came and toured America and gave speeches about the suffrage movement in Britain to further their cause abroad as well, and to kind of show support as well for the women's suffrage, the suffrage movement in America. And it was really interesting because in a lot of her speeches, she almost calls this fight for equality a civil war. That it's the men versus the women almost, which of course isn't always, that's how she was framing it, because I think she got a reaction that way. But of course there were men who were in favor of women's suffrage as well. And there were a lot of women who were not in favor of women's suffrage. There was a whole anti-suffrage movement, which I will get to in a moment. So Emily Pankhurst also, besides relating it to a civil war, also related it to the American Revolution, because American Revolution was no taxation without representation. And she felt, I'm not being represented in my government, I shouldn't have to listen to what my government says. And really took the American revolutionary ideas and applied them to the women's suffrage movement to as well, to show what they were doing in Britain, to show what they were doing in America, and how it really is an ideal the same thing. She also used the American Revolution to almost justify her more militant tactics. Emily Pankhurst was known for being one of the more militant leaders in the British suffrage movement. So her opposite would be Millicent Fawcett, who was much more of the moderate opinion and was doing things more through a diplomatic way and not as much through a militant way. But of course, Emily Pankhurst was, and one of her daughters, were more of the militant mindset and saw the American Revolution. We were not heard as Americans, as colonists, by the British government, and therefore Boston Tea Party, shot heard around the world, Battle of Bunker Hill, Battle of Yorktown, we can go on. It got bloody, it got militant. And she was really saying, like, well, I wasn't heard, and therefore I am becoming violent because I want to be heard, and you aren't hearing me, so maybe you'll pay attention to this. So that was another connection between the British movement and as well as the American movement, and harkening back to a history of are people being represented and how people want to be heard if they aren't feeling like they're being represented. So in America, you have suffragists. In Britain, you have suffragette. America still found suffragette to be an offensive term. The British took the suffragette title and kind of made it their own because they would put a hard G in it. It would be suffrage get, as in they are going to get the right to vote. And therefore, that's why sometimes you see them used interchangeably, but in a historical sense, that would have been offensive to those women. Of course, today I think the lines have been very much blurred, but historically it would have been very separate. So the anti-suffragists in America or Britain were kind of against this idea of women voting for rather similar reasons, and they thought that it would destroy their whole society. And in a sense, they thought it would be just chaos and the world turned upside down. They thought that women who got the right to vote would be more independent and prone to leave their families, that they would stop having children, and the British race would end as they knew it. And, you know, the men would have to stay home and take care of the children, and then they weren't real men, the women wouldn't be real women, and the whole idea of these gender norms would just collapse. Apparently, some people felt very threatened by that idea and therefore were against women the right to vote. They thought it'd be the loss of femininity. They thought it was unfeminine to want to have a public life to some extent because of the Edwardian ideals of womanhood. To stay at home, to take care of the children. It is very much a direct offshoot of the Victorian ideals for women, where you have the cult of domesticity, this idea that women are the center of the home, that they're the angel of the home, and that they are creating a safe, private life where their family can be raised and their husband can come home to out of their public sphere. So you very much have the public sphere and the private sphere, and women are technically supposed to be the quote-unquote head of the private sphere, and men are quote-unquote the head of the public sphere. And really you have these two spheres merging as women want to go out of the home and also have this public life. So these ideals of women staying at home, of being quiet, of not having a voice in politics. There was also the ideas that women are supposed to be submissive to their husbands, and that women were supposed to submit to their husbands and therefore submit to their political ideals. And one of the fears, I guess you could say, is that men would then have like 2 votes because the wife would be expected to vote just as her husband would vote. And also anti-suffragists or people who didn't want women to have the right to vote were saying, well, you already do have the right to vote, you're just represented by your husband. Like we have representatives that we vote for to elect us in Congress, that the same idea that these people had were, well, you have this husband and he's supposed to represent you in the public sphere while you stay in the private sphere. And it's almost unnatural and unwomanly for you to want to venture into that public sphere. Of course, when you have World War I and this whole changing world, women have to get out into the public sphere, and then, well, they're there. They're not going back. So women in Britain technically weren't not allowed to vote until 1832. So we really have only about 100-year span where women were legally not allowed to vote. Otherwise, women just didn't vote, or there were different qualifications. There was a whole, in the 1830s in Britain, there's a whole reform movement that is also going on where more men get enfranchised to vote, because not always in England were men always allowed to vote, or not all classes of men, or men who did not necessarily own property, or you had to own so much property. There were a lot of restrictions on who could vote. And Britain is slowly moving towards this idea of universal suffrage, which I think they eventually reach, but it's not for a long time. But starting in the 1830s, when you have some of this radical change shaking up Great Britain, and they're doing this kind of political revolution to make sure that they don't have a actual revolution like France did. They want to, all of their aristocracies would like to keep their heads, and therefore willing to give a little in the political sense if they don't have to have a whole public uprising. Of course, there is still some political movement that is happening in or protest organizations that are occurring and starting in the 1830s and traveling through. What's really interesting about the suffrage movement is they're one of the very few organizations that get what they want through militant tactics. There are some big moments in the suffrage movement, and one of those is when Emily Davidson gets trampled on and ends up becoming a martyr for the British suffrage movement when she gets trampled at the Royal Ascot horse race. No one knows if she was trying to end her own life, or if she was just trying to pin the suffrage colors on the king's horse to show support for the movement and to bring attention to the movement. Historians debate that to this day. We don't know what her intention was, but we do know what happened, and is that the horse that she was trying to pin the colors on did in fact run her over, and she therefore became the first martyr of the suffragette cause in Great Britain. And Emily Pankhurst and a few of the other suffrage leaders organized a very, very large funeral for her in her honor, which really it shook the fence of people who were kind of on the fence as to if women should get the right to vote, and having them fall off on either side in support or opposition because of this one tragic event. So you have, the suffragettes who are willing to give their lives for the right to vote. And then you have people who are against that, the anti-suffragists. But really with Emily Davidson is they're willing to give their lives to have this right to vote, to be heard publicly. And that really spurs the movement. Of course, this happens right before World War I. So this movement where they just have their first martyr, it's coming to its height, and then it just plateaus and kind of falls dormant almost because of World War I. But then it's right after World War I where some women do get the right to vote in Great Britain. So the colors that Emily Davidson was trying to pin onto the king's horse were the suffragette colors, and that is the color of purple, the color of green, and the color of white, usually put into some form of sash or pendant or cockade sometimes. And that really became like the suffrage colors in the early Edwardian era, in that early 1900s, and that's when the movement really, really picks up, in part due to the militant nature of it. Purple is for royalty and nobility, and the white is for purity, and the green is for hope and fertility. So they're still trying to have a feminine appeal while still being suffragists, because a lot of the anti-suffrage caricatures and cartoons really showed these suffragists as being masculine, as being quite grotesque and ugly, and the most, what you would say is quote-unquote unfeminine for the time especially. Also cats. There was the idea that women were like cats and then men were like dogs, so then you have a lot of cats used in anti-suffrage propaganda. But then the women in the suffrage community took back the cat because they were like, well, this is my cat and I love it, and toured around America with it. And there's a lot of different symbolism and such that goes along with the suffrage movement. The suffrage colors in Britain are very similar to the suffrage colors in America, as well. Some of the suffrage colors in America, not everyone always adopted all of the same colors. Gold was the only color, I believe, that was used by all suffrage organizations in America. and then you have gold and white, and then you have gold, purple, and white. So the gold, purple, and white is very similar to the gold, the green, purple, and white that was used in Great Britain. I think one of the largest takeaways that I have from studying the suffrage movement is how much these women actually suffered in order to bring the right to vote to women. There in Britain, there was this act called, quote unquote, the Cat and Mouse Act, where women would be imprisoned for protesting for the suffrage cause. And they would be taken to jail, where they would refuse to eat. They would go on a hunger strike. They were then force-fed and strapped down to a chair with a tube poured down their throat, and they would then have this substance poured into them, where they were being very malnourished because that wasn't a really true supply of nutrition. So then they would go on hunger strike for a while, and then they would be released. And then they would get caught again because they would continue to do these actions of protest that would end up getting them brought back into police custody. And this went on for a very long amount of time, and it almost became, it's like a cat and a mouse. It's the police chasing the woman and coming back. So sometimes when I stand in line and I'm thinking, oh, it's hot, oh, it's early, I had to wake up early to go do this, I also then think women for a very long amount of time in history have not had this political action to vote. People have died, like Emily Davidson, for women's right to vote. I can stand here outside a little bit early. I can get up early, and I can go and do my public duty and make my voice be heard because they allowed it. They made a way for my voice to be heard in a public setting where I don't have to go out and protest and yell in the streets to have my political opinion heard. I can go to the ballot box like everyone else.
All right, thank you so much, Marie. And folks, Marie is also a fantastic seamstress, and I'm sure you've noticed my sash today. Marie has made these historically accurate suffrage sashes, and we're actually raffling off a sash to raise donations for our educational programming. And tickets are just $5, and of course, the more tickets you buy, the more chances you have to win. So if you are interested, you can visit www.negahc.org/donations. So I hope that you will consider a donation and have a great chance to win one of these really cool suffrage sashes. So I also noticed that we have some questions in the chat. While we won't be able to answer questions live today, please go ahead and type any questions that you have so that we can make a follow-up Q&A video. So please don't hesitate to ask questions. So next, we'll be hearing from Lesley Jones, who curated our new special exhibit, Voices for the Vote. So if you are in the area in Gainesville, Georgia, we do hope that you will visit us to see this exhibit in person. You'll find artifacts from our archives that represent the lives of women in Hall County from pre-Civil War to the 1970s. Hear the speeches of suffragists like Lucy Stone and Frederick Douglass. And you will also learn about the anti-suffrage movement in Georgia and much more. And at the end of our program today, we will give you sort of a sneak peek for one of those speeches that you can see in the exhibit. We will conclude today's program with a speech by Frederick Douglass that he gave at a women's suffrage convention. All right, so without further ado, here's my interview with our archives manager and historian, Lesley Jones.
So the women's suffrage movement started in 1848 in Rochester, New York. It was originally a movement for abolition that they started, but then it went towards women's suffrage. Women wanted the right to vote as well as Black people, but it wasn't one or the other at the time. And then when the Civil War happened, it kind of went on a hiatus until they could get abolition finally completed. There were two different groups. There was the NWSA, the National Women's Suffrage Association, and the AWSA, the American Women's Suffrage Association. The NWSA was not for the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote before them. They felt that they deserved the right before black men. The AWSA was okay with black men being able to vote first. They just wanted women to vote. So it didn't bother them that men got to vote first, as long as women got to vote eventually. So something that helped that a lot of people don't realize was spiritualism, the occult spiritualism, which was women being able to talk to the dead. With spiritualism, women were able to leave the house, were able to do tours and lectures and talk about suffrage as well as spiritualism in forms of being a man or as a spirit or as someone talking with a spirit, and they would talk about suffrage and all kinds of movements, even the abolition movement at the time, because spiritualism started in 1848 at the same time as the Women's Suffrage Convention. If you were a spiritualist, you were more than likely a suffragist as well. The women that were spiritualists were usually the outspoken, extroverted women that wanted to get a point across, not just be another voice in the crowd. And that's one of the reasons spiritualism kept going, was because they wanted their voices to be heard, even if it was through spirits. So Susan B. Anthony really wanted suffrage just for upper class white women. Alice Paul wanted suffrage for all women, all races, all classes. So the biggest thing was that when Susan B. Anthony went out and tried to get the vote, she wasn't looking for everyone to get it, and Alice Paul did, and her lectures were way more successful than Elizabeth Cady Stanton's because of that. I think one of the reasons Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are so well known is because they did help found the movement. Did they necessarily help all the time? No. They kind of hindered it with the separation of NWSA and AWSA. With the split, it created different classes and genders in the both groups. So most of NWSA was upper class white women, and AWSA supported all different races and genders, and a lot of men were a part of AWSA. So the anti-suffragists weren't necessarily anti-women, they were just anti-separation from their husbands and traditional Christian values. They thought that whatever husbands felt is what they also would vote anyway. So why give them the right to vote if they were going to vote the exact same way? The largest anti-suffrage movement was in Georgia, actually. Mildred Rutherford was the historian for the Daughters of the Confederacy, and she also was a president of an anti-suffrage movement. That basically, she just thought that men had their rights at heart and they knew what women wanted, and they should follow the religious rights that they were given to by men. The different methods of protest, I think in the 1800s was more prim and proper. They went through channels such as senators and representatives and governors and things like that and asked them nicely for the vote. In the 1900s to the actual ratification, they were more militant. They did protests. They would starve themselves to get their point across. They would get themselves arrested on purpose just to get the message out. And I think that's why it helped and it spread farther than the 1800s suffrage movement, because of how strong they were against just doing it the prim and proper way. They were tired of it. They didn't want to do it anymore. They portrayed women in the 1800s more as they were a nuisance. They were in the way. They weren't really heard anyway, so it wasn't a big deal. But in the 1920s, they were a threat. They were actually getting the point across to other women who didn't even think about voting before. I think what a lot of people don't realize is Frederick Douglass was a huge part of the women's suffrage movement. He was not just an abolitionist, and he was the very first man to attend a women's rights convention, the one in 1848. Frederick Douglass was a huge supporter and continued until he died to support the women's suffrage movement. He believed that the world would be a better place if men and women could vote, of color and gender. It didn't matter. I think it's interesting that even though women supported Frederick Douglass when he talked about the women's suffrage movement. They didn't treat him as seriously as they did when he was talking about abolition. I think even though he talked until his literal dying day, he died the day he did another convention for women, that he was in support of women regardless if they treated him badly or they didn't want the Black people to get the right to vote first. He was a key part of the 1800s suffrage movement, and I think his influence helped in the 1920s as well. Someone a lot of people don't know about is Victoria Woodhull. She was actually the first woman to run for president over 50 years before women got the vote. She ran 3 times, and her running mate was Frederick Douglass. She also was a spiritualist, so that's another example of how spiritualism helped with the women's suffrage movement. She was on the Equal Rights Party, and above all else, even in her spiritualism debates, her number one concern was getting women's right to vote. So Victoria Woodhull was radical in the sense that she believed in free love, that if you want to get divorced, you should. If you want to have more than one partner, you should be able to. And I think that was one of the reasons why women didn't take her seriously, even in the Equal Rights Party. Elizabeth Cady Stanton herself was not for Victoria Woodhull and was not happy when she decided to be in free love movement. She also cut her hair like a man. She dressed like a man. She did not believe in the moral conventions that other women did. She believed if you wanted to dress how you wanted to dress, you should. So in the 1900s, I think also one of the reasons that the movement went farther than it did in the 1800s was because when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony retired, the AWSA and the NWSA converged and created a new group, and they went farther and actually got the vote once they both were not involved in the movement any longer. I think the biggest form of communication for a suffragist, even if they didn't say it, was the sashes, the purple, white, and yellow sashes. That just automatically signified that you were a suffragist. You didn't even have to say it. So the 3 colors of the sashes were purple, white, and gold. The purple meant loyalty, the white meant purity, and the gold meant light. It was a little bit different. The British actually started it in 1910, and then the American suffrage did it in 1913. So they took the colors of British suffrage and just changed the green to gold. So in the 1800s, when a woman got married, their title, their fortune, even their clothing went to the husbands. So in the 1900s, when they finally did get the vote, they got to keep whatever they brought into the marriage. It was totally different. There was a dowry, but it wasn't necessarily given just to the men when it happened. Marriage was more equal, not necessarily all together like in the 50s and 60s. It got further, but women finally had their voice heard by husbands and by other men. So even though the 19th Amendment hadn't been ratified yet, there were states like Colorado and Wyoming that let women vote, and it was because during the westward expansion, they wanted more population in those states. So they thought if they gave women the right to vote, more people would come to those states and live there. The vote for women in the Midwest was successful in Colorado and Wyoming, but nowhere else. It did get farther into the north. I think New Jersey gave women the right to vote, but other than that, it was the 19th Amendment that gave the other states. So the Black women's suffrage did start in the 1800s. They had their own suffrage movements. It did not get very far because they were still trying to get Black men to vote, and when they did, white women essentially wanted the vote for themselves, and then Black women were kind of an afterthought. In the 1920s, they did have suffrage movements, and because of them, they actually combined with the NWSA and did a large protest to the White House and helped further the movement and get it ratified. So some early Black leaders in the suffrage movement were Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. They both were part of the NWSA, and even when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were against Black women voting first, they still supported the NWSA and the AWSA. They just wanted to get the movement passed. So they wanted everyone to hear what they had to say, even these women that didn't agree that they should get the vote. I think as a historian, one of the most interesting things is women's suffrage because of how hard it was to get them the vote. It took over 80 years from the very first convention to 1920 to actually get it done. And as a historian, it's just very interesting to see how women and men were desperate to get the vote either ratified or annulled.
All right, thank you so much, Lesley. And next, I would like to present the excellent research conducted by our wonderful intern, Ruth Moreno, who worked with Lesley on our new special exhibit to highlight specifically the role of Black suffragists. So, we're only going to go over a few, and of course, there are just so many women that we have not gotten to today. If there are particular women that you're curious about, please comment in the chat. Let us know what your questions are or your comments, and like I said, we can do a follow-up discussion with Marie and Lesley. Okay, so our first woman is Ida B. Wells. So, Wells was born into slavery in 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and she died in 1931 in Chicago, Illinois. She was an African-American journalist who led an anti-lynching campaign during the 1890s. She was educated at Rust University, which was a freedmen's school for African Americans, and she started teaching at the age of 14. In 1892, 3 friends of hers were attacked by a white mob and lynched, and this drove her to fight against lynching through her writing. And in 1909, she participated in the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And when white women were given the right to vote in Chicago in 1910, they did attempt to ban Black women from also voting. And Wells, at this time, formed the Alpha Suffrage Club to promote the election of Black men and women to public office. Next, we have Nanny Helen Burroughs. Burroughs was born in 1879 in Orange, Virginia, and she died in 1961 in Washington, D.C., so quite an interesting lifespan, as she did get to see the ratification of the 19th Amendment and the early stages of the Civil Rights Movement. Her father was an educated freeman and preacher, and her mother, who was formerly enslaved, really devoted her pursuits to education for her 2 daughters. And Burroughs did receive that education in Washington, D.C. at a high school specifically for African Americans. She quickly became a prominent African American educator, a church leader, an organizer, and a suffrage supporter. Burroughs helped establish the National Association of Colored Women in 1896 and founded the National Training School for Women and Girls in Washington, D.C. in 1909, which taught job skills for women. In 1900, Burroughs gave a famous speech titled "How the Sisters Are Hindered from Helping," and this is really what propelled her to a national presence and recognition. And this eventually led her to form the Women's Convention, or WC, which is the largest Black women's organization in the United States. We have Mary Terrell. So Mary was born in 1863 in Memphis, Tennessee, and she died in 1954 in Maryland. She was the daughter of 2 formerly enslaved parents. Her father was actually one of the most successful African-American businessmen of the time, the first African-American millionaire in America. She attended Oberlin College and became one of the first African-American women to earn a college degree. She worked alongside Ida B. Wells to fight against lynching, as she also experienced the death of a friend from lynching. She moved to Washington, D.C., and she became involved in the women's suffrage movement there and started touring the country to lecture. In 1896, she and fellow activists found the National Association of Colored Women, and she serves as the first president. And she coined their motto, which was "Lifting as we climb." After the passage of the 19th Amendment, Terrell continued to fight for equal rights during the early stages of the civil rights movement. So many fascinating women and fascinating stories, but our time has almost come to an end. But do stick around because I want you to have a chance to hear a speech by Frederick Douglass. But before that, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and I do hope that you will continue your own learning about this time in our history, and I do look forward to discussing your questions that you have for us in the chat. Be sure that you are following us on Facebook and subscribe to us on YouTube so that you can make sure to see when we do post that discussion. And if you just can't get enough history, then you are an excellent candidate for our digital membership program, which is as little as $3 a month or $35 a year. And we have members-only live streams. We're developing special members-only podcast episodes and video lessons as well. So you can go to www.negahc.org/member. I'll also put that in the chat if you are interested. Our next live stream, I will actually be presenting, and that is this Friday. And I'm going to be portraying suffragist Lucy Stone and presenting a speech that she gave and then discussing her life. And that is this Friday, August 21st at 2 p.m. And so I do encourage you to become a digital member so you can enjoy even more of our programming. But to conclude today's program, I would like to end with this speech by suffragist and abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Thank you again for joining us, and I do look forward to seeing you in the chat for future live streams. Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, when I received from your honored president an invitation to be present this evening, I neither expected nor aspired to come before you at this important state of your proceedings. I am but only a humble layman in the woman's suffrage church. I do not know that I am in good and regular standing, even that much of it which holds its annual meetings in the place where I reside. Yet I am sure that I am thoroughly in sympathy with the woman's suffrage movement and am working for its advancement. I can say, however, without the slightest affection of diffidence, that I prefer that some other person, someone of the noble women I see around me, who by ability, eloquence, and devotion to this cause is entitled to and should occupy the post of honor now allotted to me. Man has at best a very moderate claim to prominence on this platform. He may well feel himself sufficiently honored, if admitted even to take a back seat. He is the sinner. Woman is the preacher. She is her own best advocate. On such occasions as this, she holds the post of honor and the post of usefulness by virtue of her moral sovereignty and by right of her superior efficiency. No man, however eloquent, can speak for a woman as a woman can speak for herself. Nevertheless, I hold that this cause is not altogether and exclusively woman's cause. It is the cause of human brotherhood, as well as the cause of human sisterhood, and both must rise and fall together. Woman cannot be elevated without elevating man, and man cannot be depressed without depressing woman also. I used to say, if you want to keep a man out of the mud, you should black his boots. If you want him to expect something of himself, you must expect something of him. I say the same of woman. Throw around her robes of power and dignity of complete citizenship. Make her responsible for the good or ill of the Republic, make her see that she is something more than a cipher in this world. And she will develop a character higher than is now dreamed of in her present dwarfed condition. She will feel her responsibility. She will inform herself on the questions uppermost in the state and will qualify herself to pass upon them and be more fully a companion of man than ever before. Exalted as she now is in this country over the women of the Eastern world, she will be more exalted when she shall, as she certainly will, achieve her complete citizenship and suffrage